history. Some early observation-based ideas about language acquisition were proposed by Plato, who felt that word meaning mapping in some form was innate. Additionally, Sanskrit grammarians debated for over 12 centuries whether humans' ability to recognize the meaning of words was God-given, possibly innate, or passed down by previous generations and learned from already established conventions. A child learning the word for cow by listening to trusted speakers talking about cows. Philosophers in ancient societies were interested in how humans acquired the ability to understand and produce language well before empirical methods for testing those theories were developed, but for the most part they seemed to regard language acquisition as a subset of man's ability to acquire knowledge and learn concepts. Empiricists like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke argued that knowledge and, for Locke, language emerged ultimately from abstracted sense impressions. These arguments leaned towards the nurture side of the argument, that language is acquired through sensory experience, which led to Rudolf Carnap's Aufbau, an attempt to learn all knowledge from sense datum, using the notion of remembered as similar to bind them into clusters, which would eventually map into language. Proponents of behaviorism argued that language may be learned through a form of operant conditioning. In B.F. Skinner's Verbal Behavior, 1957, he suggested that the successful use of a sign, such as a word or lexical unit, given a certain stimulus reinforces its momentary or contextual probability. Since operant conditioning is contingent on reinforcement by rewards, a child would learn that a specific combination of sounds stands for a specific thing through repeated, successful associations made between the two. A successful use of a sign would be one in which the child is understood. For example, a child saying up when he or she wants to be picked up and rewarded with the desired response from another person, thereby reinforcing the child's understanding of the meaning of that word and making it more likely that he or she will use that word in a similar situation in the future. Some empiricist theories of language acquisition include the statistical learning theory, Charles F. Hockett of language acquisition, relational frame theory, functionalist linguistics, social interactionist theory, and usage-based language acquisition. Skinner's behaviorist idea was strongly attacked by Noam Chomsky in a review article in 1959, calling it largely mythology and a serious delusion. Arguments against Skinner's idea of language acquisition through operant conditioning include the fact that children often ignore language corrections from adults. Instead, children typically follow a pattern of using an irregular form of a word correctly, making errors later on, and eventually returning to the proper use of the word. For example, a child may correctly learn the word gave past tense of give, and later on use the word gived. Eventually, the child will typically go back to learning the correct word, gave. Chomsky claimed the pattern is difficult to attribute to Skinner's idea of operant conditioning as the primary way that children acquire language. Chomsky argued that if language were solely acquired through behavioral conditioning, children would not likely learn the proper use of a word and suddenly use the word incorrectly. Chomsky believed that Skinner failed to account for the central role of syntactic knowledge in language competence. Chomsky also rejected the term learning, which Skinner used to claim that children learn language through operant conditioning. Instead, Chomsky argued for a mathematical approach to language acquisition, based on a study of syntax as a typically human phenomenon. The capacity to acquire and use language is a key aspect that distinguishes humans from other beings. Although it is difficult to pin down what aspects of language are uniquely human, there are a few design features that can be found in all known forms of human language but that are missing from forms of animal communication. For example, many animals are able to communicate with each other by signaling to the things around them, but this kind of communication lacks the arbitrariness of human vernaculars, in that there is nothing about the sound of the word dog that would hint at its meaning. Other forms of of animal communication may utilize arbitrary sounds but are unable to combine those sounds in different ways to create completely novel messages that can then be automatically understood by another. Hackett called this design feature of human language productivity. It is crucial to the understanding of human language acquisition that we are not limited to a finite set of words, but rather must be able to understand and utilize a complex system that allows for an infinite number of possible messages. So, while many forms of animal communication exist, they differ from human languages in that they have a limited range of vocabulary tokens, and the vocabulary items are not combined syntactically to create phrases. General approach is a major debate in understanding language acquisition is how these capacities are picked up by infants from the linguistic input. Input in the linguistic context is defined as all words, contexts, and other forms of language to which a learner is exposed relative to acquired proficiency in first or second languages. Nativists such as Noam Chomsky have focused on the hugely complex nature of human grammars, the finiteness and ambiguity of the input that children receive, and the relatively limited cognitive abilities of an infant. From these characteristics, they conclude that the process of language acquisition in infants must be tightly constrained and guided by the biologically given characteristics of the human brain. Otherwise, they argue, it is extremely difficult to explain how children, within the first 5 years of life, routinely master the complex, largely tacit grammatical rules of their native language. Additionally, the evidence of such rules in their native language is all indirect. Adult speech to children cannot encompass what children know by the time they've acquired their native language. Other scholars, however, have resisted the possibility that infants' routine success at acquiring the grammar of their native language requires anything more than the forms of learning seen with other cognitive skills, including such mundane motor skills as learning to ride a bike. In particular, there has been resistance to the possibility that human biology includes any form of specialization for language. This conflict is often referred to as the nature and nurture debate. Of course, most scholars acknowledge that certain aspects of language acquisition must result from the specific ways in which the human brain is wired, a nature component which accounts for the failure of non-human species to acquire human languages, and that certain others are shaped by the particular language environment in which a person is raised, a nurture component which accounts for the fact that humans raised in different societies acquire different languages. The as yet unresolved question is the extent to which the specific cognitive capacities in the nature component are also used outside of language. Emergentist theories, such as McQueenie's competition model, posit that language acquisition is a cognitive process that emerges from the interaction of biological pressures and the environment. According to these theories, neither nature nor nurture alone is sufficient to trigger language learning. Both of these influences must work together in order to allow children to acquire a language. The proponents of these theories argue that general cognitive processes subserve language acquisition, in that the end result of these processes is language-specific phenomena, such as word learning and grammar acquisition. The findings of many empirical studies support the predictions of these theories, suggesting that language acquisition is a more complex process than many believe. Empiricism. Although Chomsky's theory of a generative grammar has been enormously influential in the field of linguistics since the 1950s, many criticisms of the basic assumptions of generative theory have been put forth by cognitive functional linguistics, who argue that language structure is created through language use. These linguists argue that the concept of a language acquisition device (LAD) is unsupported by evolutionary anthropology, which tends to show a gradual adaptation of the human brain and vocal cords to the use of language, rather than a sudden appearance of a complete set of binary parameters delineating the whole spectrum of possible grammars ever to have existed and ever to exist. On the other hand, cognitive functional theorists use this anthropological data to show how human beings have evolved the capacity for grammar and syntax to meet our demand for linguistic symbols. Binary parameters are common to digital computers but may not be applicable to neurological systems such as the human brain. Further, the generative theory has several constructs, such as movement, empty categories, complex underlying structures, and strict binary branching, that cannot possibly be acquired from any amount of linguistic input. It is unclear that human language is actually anything like the generative conception of it, since language, as imagined by nativists, is unlearnably complex. Subscribers to this theory argue that it must therefore be innate. Nativists hypothesize that some features of syntactic categories exist before a child is exposed to any experienced categories on which the child maps words of their language as they learn their native language. A different theory of language, however, may yield different conclusions. While all theories of language acquisition posit some degree of innateness, they vary in how much value they place on this innate capacity to acquire language. Empiricism places less value on the innate knowledge, arguing instead that the input, combined with both general and language-specific learning capacities, is sufficient for acquisition. Since 1980, linguists studying children, such as Melissa Bowerman, and psychologists following Jean Piaget, like Elizabeth Bates and Jean Mandler, came to suspect that there may indeed be many learning processes involved in the acquisition process, and that ignoring the role of learning may have been a mistake. In